Charlie, the concept of extrasensory perception, the paranormal, pervades our culture. You see it all over the mass media. And in my opinion, it's worthless. It's garbage. It's nonsense. It panders to public interest in these things. But when one studies the field, if one could show that even less than 1%, even one event, really does violate the traditional understanding of materialistic science, then it's enormously important. Now, based upon your enormous contributions to the field over many decades, I'd like to explore this. First, by giving us some definitions, some clarity to this profusion of words that sometimes all get jumbled together under these paranormal headings.
Yeah, there's no doubt there's a lot of nonsense thrown together under the heading paranormal, but let's make it quite clear what I mean by that. Para means literally alongside of the normal. We have a view of the way the world normally operates, and so we can say in this situation such and such can happen, but so and so can't happen, because we know how the world works. Suppose we set up a situation in which, given all we know about the ordinary reality, nothing can happen. Let's say I put you in a room 10 miles away from here and have you look at go through a deck of shuffled cards. While back here I try to guess at them. Given all we know normally, unless you have a telephone line or a radio transmitter or something like that, you're looking at the cards 10 miles away is not going to have any useful effect on me. If it does, we have a paranormal event. Okay, we now have several thousand experiments accumulated over the last century in which paranormal events happen. That is, you set up a situation where nothing can happen by the normal rules, but something does happen. Now, as to what specifically happens, there's what I call the big five, the 5 things that each have several hundred well-done experiments to show that they exist. One of these is telepathy. Somebody's trying to send some information from a distance. You pick that up enough of the time to know that it's not chance. Clairvoyance means the direct perception of the state of the physical world when it's not in somebody else's mind. If you'd taken that deck of cards, shuffled it very thoroughly, but didn't look at it while somebody back here was trying to get at it and the score was high, that's clairvoyance. Precognition's the easiest experiment to do. You simply say 5 minutes from now or 5 hours from now, I'm going to shuffle this deck of cards very thoroughly without looking. Please write down now what the order of the deck will be. And I always chuckle about that one because it's so easy to describe, but part of my mind goes totally bonkers at the concept. But it works enough of the time that we know that there's a phenomenon called precognition.
Now, those 3 elements, telepathy, mind reading, so-called, clairvoyance, direct perception of something without a mind, and precognition, knowing the future in some sense, those 3 are lumped together in what's traditionally called extrasensory perception.
Right, ESP, yes.
Okay.
But as human beings, we don't just take in information, we affect the world. So there are 2 phenomena of affecting the world when normally nothing should happen. One is called psychokinesis, or the old term telekinesis for action at a distance. You simply will something to happen, and without any physical intermediation, sometimes something happens. The classic experiment for this was to have people watch a machine throw dice. And you'd tell the person, okay, for the next dozen trials, make it come up with more 6s. Fine, thank you. Now make it come up with more 5s and so forth. You did this systematically so you didn't have problems with bias in the dice. You get enough deviations from chance expectation to show that the mind was somehow affecting that. The 5th phenomena may be the same as psychokinesis, but it's convenient to put it in a different category, and that's what we would call psychic healing, where you try to affect some biological system, usually in the direction of it's a sick system, and you want it to heal more rapidly. And again, we now have dozens and dozens of well-done double-blind experiments to show that the wishing makes a difference, even though there's no normal physical mechanism to account for it. These are the 5 kinds of psi, the 5 kinds of things well established. There are some other things that simply aren't as well established, but those are the ones you can bet on.
Now, a lot of the things we see in the press have to do with apparitions or, ghosts or Bermuda triangles or occult or it's a lot of other things, but you're, at least for the time being, putting those aside, concentrating on these 5.
Right.
Okay.
Those others are interesting, but they simply don't have the quality of evidence for them, and some of them may be delusory. I mean, I don't know whether the Bermuda Triangle is really something real or a funny fluke of
And then you have
statistics or what.
mediums and communication with the dead and all sorts of other things, which some people say could be psi, super psi, or some people
Right.
say are real.
Now I call those things the many maybes rather than the big five.
Okay. All right, let's concentrate on the big five. And I know you feel strongly that these, through hundreds for each category and collectively thousands of experiments, sort of meta-analysis, putting them all together, are so far beyond statistical significance as not even worthy of discussion. Many other people, as you know, violently disagree with that and feel that if you're not putting in all the experiments that didn't work or couldn't work or other kinds of things. I don't want to deal with methodologies, but to recognize that if what you say is true, even if what you say is 1,000% true, that there's something very significant here. Mm-hmm. So I want to explore what that significance could be in your point of view. And let's start with what you have to admit is the very low replicability of these phenomena. At best, even in the best way, you really have to do a fine statistical analysis to tease out any effect, even in the best experiments.
I have to disagree with you on that, Robert. For certain experimenters, these extrasensory effects replicate quite reliably in the form of clairvoyance known as remote viewing, for instance. I was involved in one of the government programs on that for a long time. It was routine to get results that clearly were due to clairvoyance of some sort or another. It was interesting when it didn't work, because then we could figure out what we did wrong. The problem is that the experimenter is part of the experiment here, okay? I mean, the ordinary psychological experiment says, I'm the objective experimenter, and I'm manipulating you with some kind of situation or stimulus, and what I think about it has no effect. I'm just studying the reactions in you. But if we're studying an unknown method of communication between people, then you and I are in communication, and my attitude is probably going to affect how you perform. So we have certain experimenters who routinely get positive results in ESP experiments and others who don't. To me, this says we need to stop pretending to objectivity we don't have. Instead, what are the characteristics of experimenters who get results, and what are the characteristics of those who don't?
Okay, but at the very best, I still think that you have a very minor effect, even in the best cases.
No. Again, I'd have to disagree with you. And I'm thinking now of some of the remote viewing work which was used for practical applications. Okay, the government, through various intelligence agencies, the CIA and the like, supported research on remote viewing for many years, not because they were altruistic about supporting research, but because they had practical intelligence problems and they couldn't get information. And in too many cases, they got relevant information by using clairvoyance.
Why don't they still do it if that's the case?
Because it's a political football. What better way to attack an opponent by saying, oh, next thing you know, they'll have spiritualist mediums in the White House or something like that. But let me give you an example of practical applications. And I can tell you this because it's come out through Freedom of Information Act stuff. Otherwise, I couldn't. Because to be a consultant on this project, I had to get a top secret security clearance. I had to sign all these papers that kept talking about $10,000 fine and 10 years in jail if I reveal this. Although there was one cheap one where it was only 5 years in jail and a $5,000 fine. In a lot of experiments involving ESP, the size of the effect is small, even though statistically it's very unlikely. So for instance, if somebody's guessing red or black on a shuffled deck of playing cards, they might average, say, 52%, which means most of the time they're guessing, and every once in a while they got an extra one. But if they keep that up for a long time, it becomes very meaningful. You can't attribute it to chance.
Right.
But I have to add that sometimes the sheer size of an ESP effect can be large enough to be practically useful. The remote viewing program that was sponsored by the CIA and other government intelligence agencies is a good example. This was used for practical intelligence uses sometimes. As one example, there was a case where a Soviet bomber carrying a hydrogen bomb disappeared somewhere in Africa. Naturally, we wanted to find it, the Soviets wanted to find it. Nobody could find it through any of the conventional ways. They finally used remote viewers who said this plane crashed in this very soft stuff and it's mostly buried, only the tail is sticking up and it's near such and such a location. They found it. That's a pretty practical application.
But I still say that the effect is small, even if statistically it cannot be refuted, which is controversial, but I'll give you that. But if this is so significant that it indicates some non-physical reality, why is it so small?
Why should it be big? I mean, think of it from the opposite direction. We now have enormous numbers of ways to communicate over distances very, very effectively. Telephone, radio, satellites, and so forth. We don't need extrasensory perception most of the time. If you look at what happens out in real life, forget the laboratory effects for a moment, but the things that happen to actual people, the times it's strong when you get a lot of information by some kind of ESP are usually times of emotional crisis in somebody's life. A loved one of yours is in a very bad accident and they're on the verge of death, and you suddenly have a dream about them that makes you want to trace them down or something like that. And some people have speculated that, you know, before we had all these modern communications, ESP played a more important role in alerting people to that. But at another level, I'm not sure that ESP is designed to work in ordinary life. In trying to make sense of states of consciousness, for instance, from a dualistic perspective, I've postulated that ESP is actually the mechanism by which the mind reads what's going on in the brain through a kind of inner clairvoyance.
Inner clairvoyance.
A kind of inner clairvoyance. It's a clairvoyance that's focused on the activity of the brain, which in turn is connected to the senses in the body, which is what you need to know to take care of the body. In turn, while a lot of those reactions are handled by automatic circuits in the brain, some of it is decisions that the mind makes, and I think the mind influences by some kind of psychokinesis various brain actions, so the body then does the appropriate kind of thing. That's a testable theory, incidentally, because it says if you had random devices that are more brain-like, that have all these complicated interconnections, they should be more easily influenced by a mind than simple things like just on-off kinds of switches and the like.
So what you're saying is that at least two of the main characteristics of paranormal activity, clairvoyance, being able to sense things, and psychokinesis, the ability to move things or make things happen by mind alone, are more important in an internal functioning way between brain and mind in your dualism than in the outside world where it may have a very weak impact.
That's my best understanding, subject to new information coming in, of course, that this is the mechanism that philosophers have always wondered about in dualism. If the mind and brain are different things, how do they interact? I think they interact through a kind of clairvoyance and psychokinesis. That's the mechanism. And it's the rare occasions when that clairvoyance or psychokinesis is focused on something outside the brain that we even know there are such things as clairvoyance and psychokinesis.
So this is, if that's true, enormously fundamental in our understanding of what reality is all about. You believe that, I assume, that these examples, however rare or difficult they may be to discern, are a window into seeing a very fundamental part of how the mind works.
Well, I'm inclined to agree, except when you say you believe. I always get cautious about what I believe. I think this is a sensible way of making sense of what we see so far, and it has consequences that you can actually research to kind of clarify. So it's the best I can do, but I don't believe it in any absolute sense, right? I'm not that smart enough to come up with beliefs that are always right.